Okay, so moving over to the discussion section, let me share my screen here. Um, I was given the question, what are the challenges for advancing current task level benchmarks for robot manipulation? I interpret task level benchmarks as being um, sort of benchmarks for complete end-to-end tasks, and instead of subsystem or yeah, quality metrics and other things for like grasping that are more traditional. Let me also just take the opportunity to point out some of the work we've done in this area that you can access from the YCB website. So if you're not familiar with YCB, it was a kit of objects for benchmarking in robot grasping and manipulation. The idea being that if people had similar objects, they could more consistently evaluate performance. And the idea, besides, was always to take it further than just the objects and have it be a benchmarking effort. And we've done a bunch of that stuff. We had a special issue in RAL that was published recently. And if you go to the YCB website and you click on this protocols and benchmarks tab, you can sort of get down to the benchmarks for various benchmarks that other people have proposed. Okay, so in the process of doing this, we thought a lot about what makes for effective benchmarking protocols, and some of the items are a well-defined procedure, well-defined quantification of performance, and broadly applicable, meaning a lot of people would use it and it would be for useful approaches. And I think one thing to think about is sort of the scope of the task that your benchmarking protocol covers. So on one end of this scope would be systems level performance, and on the other end, very narrow subsystem performance. So that would be something like grasp quality or something along those lines. And then I put something in the middle here that I'll call research approach performance. So I put systems level performance, things like competition, like the Amazon picking challenge and so forth. It's really relatively easy to specify these, I would argue. Going through and generating some rules for sort of high level system performance, moving an object from point A to point B and recording the amount of time it takes you to do it or so forth is, I would say, relatively easy. Narrow subsystem performance, this is where you get into standards making organizations like IEEE, where they are publishing real detailed formal standards, usually on something very narrow. In the middle, which is what most of us are probably interested is a little less defined and I think rather difficult to specify. So I think some of the main challenges are, in terms of benchmarking for research, is that our robot systems involve many subsystems, right? We have the robot hardware, we have the perception systems, the planning systems, the control, and most of the research approaches that we do are at the subsystem level. We are typically focused on, in our lab, and our expertise is focused on hardware or perception or planning or control. So as researchers, we're often not necessarily as focused on the other areas, but those other areas have a lot of effect on our overall performance if you talk about a high-level system performance. And I think the big challenge becomes, how do you decouple the subsystem of interest from other subsystems? And that's really what you want to learn from other people's research as well, is how does that subsystem perform? So part of the issue here is that the nature of subsystems can vary widely. You could have a whole humanoid robot doing the task versus an arm only. You could have a a SCARA, gear-driven industrial robot arm, or a low impedance WAM or Baxter arm or something like that. You can have no perception at all versus very complicated perception, etc. And decoupling the performance of the subsystems is an extremely challenging task. And so I think generating task protocols, you should try to keep in mind balancing specificity versus generality. So if you have a very specific protocol, you generally have better quantification. You might be able to focus in on a specific subsystem and filter out or remove the effects as much as possible on things like controller approach or something like that. But the challenge is if you have too specific of a protocol and a focus, very few research groups are going to be able to use it, thereby reducing the effectiveness of benchmarking. So related to that, I think you should report outcomes in a benchmark in a multifaceted way. One way to do this is to have subscores. You might break down performance in terms of a number of different things. So for instance, speed, I think, is always a challenging one, right? You can always tweak things to make things faster. It might not have anything to do with the effectiveness of your research approach. So your planner might be great, and if your controller sucks, your overall system performance might not be very good. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't pay attention to your planning approach. So I think a lot of those are the dangers in terms of benchmarking. Other ways to do this is be doing multi-stage protocols. So instead of just one task, maybe you do multiple similar tasks, where you can really look at subsystem performance a little bit in a more detailed way, while getting researchers to do many different tasks in succession to also see how they perform in other different tasks. And then multifaceted. Really, the goal is to try to understand the pros and cons of the contribution, the original ideas that researchers have, and separate that as much as possible from things that they didn't care much about, like if they have crappy hardware, for instance. I also think one way to do this is to ask researchers to give some open-ended commentary. It might be guided, asking them to identify themselves what they think is going to be helpful, and so forth. So I'll just end it there. I think things like the Amazon Picking Challenge, they do a lot of good in terms of rallying researchers around a task, but I'm not sure if people really learned from those efforts, what they should take away from various teams' performances. What about the winning team's approach was really noteworthy and should be adopted by other people? And there were probably lots of things related to teams that didn't perform very well that other people should learn from. And being able to generate those protocols in such a way that really highlights the things that should be learned from, I think is the overall challenge.